All right, that was 1 minute. So we'll get started. You ready, Ola?
Yes, I'm ready.
Fantastic. Okay, well, welcome everybody for this very much hybrid presentation. We are very happy to be here to present the professional divide between writing and language studies, history, bibliometrics, and implications for WAC. My name is Tyler Carter. I'm an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric at Duke Kunshan University, which is located in Kunshan, China.
And I'm Aleksandra Swatek. I work at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań in Poland as a research assistant professor in the Scholarly Communication Research Group.
Okay. So we want to kind of contextualize what we're doing here. Wait, Ola, can we go back to, we're done with that slide. By talking about where this research comes out of. So speaking about positionality. So for me, this project, and I sort of did this kind of history project, been working on that for a while, thinking about what it means to be someone trained in writing and rhetoric, also a little second language writing, but working within a department at a university in China that is largely focused on language learning. And in working with these folks, kind of noticing similarities, but also differences in how we approach things. But it's kind of leads to the second question here in terms of that positionality. What is the common language that writing studies and language studies can share, and how can that help us sort of collaborate in institutional context, as well as in teaching, as well as in research?
Yeah, and when I think about myself as a writing scholar, I think about myself as a person who is very much involved in second language writing. So that's sort of my identity. And what comes with that is this kind of multidisciplinary perspective on what writing is, and I'm always trying to draw on different fields, such as applied linguistics, rhetoric and composition, professional and technical communication. And through that work and through that multidisciplinary identity, I always kind of struggle and with the reconciliation or thinking about how different disciplines write about research on writing, what kind of language is being used. And maybe oftentimes I ask myself if the researchers in these different disciplines are actually, doing very similar work, but using quite different terminology to describe what they're doing. So the project I'm going to talk about today tries to get at this question: can writing and language studies find a common language to consolidate knowledge? And maybe actually, if there is already a common language to consolidate knowledge existing and is being used in literature. And one of the questions we have for WAC scholarship and writing studies in general is knowledge about writing instruction fragmented, and more so, is there reciprocity between different fields that produce knowledge on writing and research writing? Are they equally looking into each other's scholarship and trying to bring that into their own work, or are there some imbalances between these different fields? And I also know that both Tyler and we're kind of sort of outsiders to WAC, and we are learning a lot about WAC during this conference, and I have been attending panels since the morning. And I know some of these questions came up before today. So I'm really interested to hear from all of you what you think about how our projects, what kind of questions they can help answer and what kind of questions they open up.
Okay, great. Yeah. Oh yeah, and one more thing we meant to say. So I happen to be in Arizona. I need to be in Arizona right now, which is why I'm not there. And Ola broke her leg in 2 places, and this is why Ola is not there. So these are just some fun facts about our lives.
Yeah, very much looking forward to be there in person. We're very excited about that, and then life happens. So we're very happy to see so many of you in the audience.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to do this in 3 parts. First, Ola will go through her bibliometric analysis. Then I will do my comparative rhetoric. And then we will have about 15 minutes time for questions and discussion at the end. So I leave it to you, Ola.
Okay, so I will tell you about my study that is an ongoing study that I have been conducting with Dr. Zekra Tashkin from Hacettepe University in Turkey and with Dr. Claire Jackson from College of the Holy Cross. And this is a study that looks at measuring the relationship between writing-centered fields using citation data. And what I mean by writing-centered fields is these fields that I have, heard mentioned today a lot, this fields of rhetoric and composition, professional and technical communication in my own field, which is language studies, or more specifically second language writing. But I also will look at the broader landscape of social sciences and humanities. And some of the very broad questions that guide my research are: what can we learn from analyzing citation data based on journal articles on writing research? And how do knowledge communities in different writing studies fields use knowledge across disciplines? What can citation data tell us about writing studies? And what can it tell us about the relationship between language studies fields, but research writing, and other fields that have writing at the center? And the methods I've been using for this research is Bibliometrics, which is the application of math and statistical methods to look at books and other forms of written communication. And it's just basically looking at citation data, as more specifically, because in our research, we assume that citation constitutes material evidence for cross-disciplinary ventures, meaning to cite research from another field is to signal engagement with its community. And that's not a new concept for most of you. Whether we are citing something because we don't agree, or we are citing something because we agree, or we want to just contextualize, find a niche, find a gap, and we have to look at literature, we typically have to look at research that has been done previously, and that just means that it has been read that you have come in contact with, and through that we can kind of think about how we engage with these different knowledge communities. And none of these, the citation studies are not typical for bibliometric or library science, information science, but it has also been used in writing studies, and you're probably familiar with the citations here that Derek Mueller has done a lot of studies using this idea of citation and citation data. But I'm also using writing studies as an umbrella term, and we're drawing in our research on this scholarship by Bezerman, and he called writing studies as this first enterprise that works towards an understanding of what writing is and what it does and how people learn to do it. This is a discipline that's engaged in a concerted effort to research writing as a multifaceted phenomenon that happens in a variety of historical, social, and physical contexts. So one of the questions that I will have will pose this challenge: is there such a thing as a writing studies that we can see in literature through the citation patterns? So I will present results from bibliometric analysis for three questions that I have that examine the relationship between language studies and writing studies. The first is a case study of how has the importance of composition and rhetoric changed in the flagship L2 writing journal, so Journal of Second Language Writing, over time. And this study has been published in Journal of Writing Analytics in 2022. And the second question is, what is the reciprocity between specific journals in writing studies divided into three groups? So language studies, professional and technical communication, and composition and rhetoric. And the third and final question that I will try to answer is, where is writing studies located in the publishing landscape of social sciences and the humanities? So these are the three questions that I will try to answer, and I will try to discuss what can we learn from these answers about the relationship between language studies and writing studies. So my first data set is a data set of 22 journals that are available for analysis through Scopus, and it's data from these journals that are titles, abstracts, references, and works cited. You have the list of these journals here, and I put them in these particular groups. Similar groupings have been used in research by Dreyer and other scholars. So in the first, for the first question, what is the importance of composition and rhetoric and how it changed in the flagship journal of second language writing? I looked at how often articles from composition and rhetoric journals have been cited in Journal of Second Language Writing over time. You will see here is a timeline every 5 years is the grouping that I looked at the citation. And you might know that, or maybe you don't, but Journal of Second Language Writings was founded in 1992. That's why the timeline starts in 1992. And at the beginning, when it was founded by Tony Silva and Elena Leckie, it was a journal that drew most of its references and works cited from composition and rhetoric journals. But over time, and looking until like 2 years ago, composition and rhetoric references and works cited are articles are number 4. So over time, we can see that the research in Journal of Second Language Writing has been moving away from composition and rhetoric. And we can think about Journal of Second Language Writing as quite representative of second language writing and community in general and its research interests and how it represents what the most current interests are of the community. And we can see that over time, Journal of Second Language Writings has started citing more applied linguistics, literacy, teaching sociolinguistics journals, testing assessment psychology journals. So it has mostly shifted a lot towards social sciences and definitely moved away from composition and rhetoric. The second question that I wanted to answer is, what is the reciprocity between specific journal groups? So as you remember, I had PTC journals, so professional technical communication journals, composition and rhetoric journals, and language studies journals. And we analyzed how often journals from this one particular group cite this other group. And then it can also be a self-citation, right? So you can see in this table, and that is not in any way surprising, that people who write articles in language journals cite articles from other language journals. So we have this self-citation. It's very normal and not surprising at all that these knowledge communities will draw on its own knowledge kind of foundation most often, right? But what is interesting is that language studies journals exhibit citation pattern typical of social sciences because there's much more citation, mean is 127, than what we see in PTC or composition and rhetoric, which is almost half, a little bit over half what we see in language journals. So these articles typically cite fewer sources, and that's more typical of humanities scholarship, just having fewer sources per article. So that's not surprising at all, but maybe it just shows an allegiance towards certain disciplinary practices. But what is interesting is that composition rhetoric is drawn from by professional technical communication and language more often than the other way around. So if you look at the next 3 groups, you look at that language journals draw on composition rhetoric and PTC journals draw on composition rhetoric with the mean of 15 and 13. But if we look at the other way around, it's almost half as much, right? So there is this reciprocity or this balance that I'm thinking about is definitely not happening. There is more interest from language and professional technical communication and composition rhetoric than there seems to be the other way around. So in terms of balance, it seems that this is not reciprocal in an equal way. And last but not least, what happens at the bottom of this table is also quite interesting because the least exchange falls on the pair of language and professional technical communication. So there's less interest in each other's scholarship, despite the obvious alignment between, English for specific purposes, which some of you might know, some of you might not know, but it's this branch of applied linguistics that looks at aviation. It looks at different like Englishes and like nursing, medical fields, all the very specific professional contexts. And it's the domain for professional communication. But PTC, professional technical communication, despite having the same kind of maybe area or focus of interest, does not draw as much on the English for specific purposes or just applied linguistics in general. So there maybe is more potential for collaboration or exchange right there. Okay, and so in the same data set, this is quite overwhelming, I'm sure, but I will explain it in a very brief way. So on top, you have I have a list of citing journals. On the left, we have the list of cited journals. These are the same journals because we are looking at data, who is citing whom, right? And then the citing journals and what are they citing is on the bottom here. You don't have to like understand all these numbers. What is important is that you see when you see the red color, you see more citation activity within the language, like the journal group. So you see Journal of Second Language Writing cites itself a lot. And then that's kind of very normal, that self-citation for journals. So this kind of line across shows that journals will cite our people who publish in a particular journal will cite work from that particular journal. Not surprising at all. And you can see that these are the rectangles that show that language studies journals cite themselves more often. There is more red, and then there is activity between these different journals, showing that there is a knowledge community, that there is exchange, there is things are happening. And then when you see the blue, so I kind of mark this blue rectangle here, so composition and rhetoric, maybe not having as much exchange with professional technical communication, language, or I guess these two is way less than it has with itself, right? So composition and rhetoric citing itself. But in looking at these relationships, what I was trying to find is what are the journals, and it came out that there are two journals that do a good job of being this kind of an agora, a place where researchers from various fields come together and their research is valued and it is read across these different writing studies fields. And what we noticed is that the Journal of English for Specific Purposes is a journal that cites journals from these three different groups more often than other journals, as well as written communication, because written communication was founded as a journal that is, its aim is to bring scholarship from across different disciplines. And you can see that the mission of Journal of Written Communication, it is active, well, and alive, because not only does it cite research from other fields, but it is also cited by all the journals from all the other fields. So kind of it cites across, and it is being cited from different groups across. And then the last, the biggest question, the biggest map that I would love to show you is, where is writing studies located in the landscape of social sciences and humanities? So is there such a thing as writing studies? Is there citation activity that shows that we're all kind of speaking the same language, for one, and then that we are like, in terms of relationship across other disciplines, that we actually are more together than apart? And how big is writing studies? So this data set, this is a separate data set. It is 27,000 publications, and we actually have a very long timeline. So it'll be between 1900 and 2020. And we used 472 search terms, which we actually extracted from that first data set from the 22 journals in writing studies. And we use these search terms to kind of search across Scopus and Web of Science in the social sciences and humanities disciplines, and to look for publications that use these search terms on writing So these were all keywords related to writing. Could be a writing process. It could be, drafts in writing, or there's a lot of different keywords. And we wanted to see who in social sciences and the humanities uses the same language that we use in across these 22 journals that's published in writing. And this is what we came up with. So it is kind of overwhelming, but let me kind of walk you through this. On top, you will see a timeline that starts with 1920 to 1929. And so the older the citation is, the article was, the darker its color or the source is on the map. The more recent it is, the brighter the color is. So it's more of yellow. So you will see names of journals in this capital letters. So for example, you'll see somewhere in the middle, College Composition and Communication or College English. So you'll see this is how the names are formatted. And then the hashtags and keywords are just keywords selected from what comes up from that particular cluster. I will not talk much about that. But what you will see is that we actually do have a writing studies cluster. So this is my very awkward marking on this map. But if we look at this area here, we do have a cluster that specifically focuses, and I would call it the writing studies cluster. And it's more together, it's closer together because we all use that common language to do research on writing than the research and writing in other fields is. And you can see that over the years, and I think somebody in the morning today mentioned that there is a lot of research in psychology on writing. There has been historically a lot of research in psychology, and it has been continued over time. So there is kind of adjacent to writing studies, but still there's some divide. Research in psychology that uses the same terminology that we use in writing research. There is further away a medical research that uses the same terminology, so it focuses on writing, studying writing, and it is quite recent. We can see education cluster, here probably sociology cluster, legal cluster, and also higher education. So in terms of, if we think about what does research on writing look in social sciences and humanities, it actually, we see that there is an ongoing effort and there's a sustained effort in researching writing, and we are quite tight together in terms of what our writing studies clusters looks like. So just to conclude, and there could be so many conclusions that comes out of this, but this research has considerations for interdisciplinarity. You're thinking about transdisciplinarity, so that there is a gap between disciplines when we think about that we are further apart, but there is common terminology that's used across disciplinary communities, and showing that there is not only linguistics and conceptual divides, but there are also bridges between disciplines. And that the divides between disciplines can be a question of perspective, really. So the more fine-grained analysis, the more divide there is between fields. And we can see, for example, that second language writing is moving away from composition and rhetoric. And we can ask, what does that mean for, writing in the disciplines or writing across curriculum when we're thinking about when we want to bring in that scholarship, if that scholarship is looking less and less like something that was more typical in the past and it's moving towards social sciences. What does it mean for WAC and WIT to be drawing on fields in social sciences and humanities? And when we think about, if you move towards medical field, and you can go towards research and writing in medical fields or legal fields, and there you can still find research that uses the same common terminology. But what challenges does it pose for practitioners if you do want to go there and find that research and apply it? And I will also say that we did not have WAC journals in our study because they are not indexed in Scopus or Web of Science, and therefore that metadata doesn't exist in this easily accessible format. So I have a couple of works cited, and I will be happy to take any questions after Tyler's part. Thank you.
Hey. Yay. Thank you, Ola. Ola, could you stop sharing the screen so I can? So give me a second. I'm gonna get this ready to go. Right. Huh. Oh, there it is. I'm looking for the share screen. I'm having trouble finding it. Okay, there it is. Oh. Okay. So can everyone see that PPT? Just raise your hand maybe if you can see it, just because I can't see anybody really very clearly. Everybody's very tiny. Okay, well, we'll get started here. So part two of this presentation, and if you have questions for Ola, please do make note of them so we can sort of keep them in mind when we get to the end of this thing. So my portion is to talk about this a recent paper that is coming out in College English. It should be this week or next week, and this is the official public debut of this paper. Comparative rhetoric of writing and language instruction in the United States. And so this is very much a humanities project and humanities paper. And essentially what I'm going to do is tell a story of how positivism and constructivism became the dominant epistemes in language and writing studies, respectively. So the assumption, one of the assumptions I'm making here is that understanding this history will allow us to see more clearly the underlying epistemological commitments in these respective fields, which will in turn allow us to better understand how to navigate these differences and similarities in a transdisciplinary kind of way. So one sort of caveat before we get going. So there's a lot of detail in this paper, but for the purposes of clarity, I left a lot of that detail out. So there's a lot of history here. So I'm really just going to be giving a skeleton outline and encourage folks, if folks are interested, that paper will be available in the next couple of weeks. So please do look for it. All right. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this thing, that this largely comes out of my experiences working at a university in China, working in a department that is language studies focused to an extreme degree, and thinking about this question: what is the difference between teaching English writing as a process and teaching English writing as an extension of language learning? And when I went to sort of go thinking about this, noticing differences and similarities, I went to go look for literature on this subject, and I wasn't able to find some. Therefore, this project came about that specifically spoke to this question in these terms. Some two secondary questions: by what criteria can we compare different approaches to writing instruction? And the criteria that I'm using is epistemology, or sort of forms of knowledge. And then there's this broader question that Ola is talking about: how can we consolidate writing studies? And maybe drawing on one point that Ola makes, I think, really well about this sort of fragmentation, that if you take this broad view of writing studies, that we are all sort of working together. But the more we focus down, we do see these differences, right? So definitely my presentation is very much about those differences, almost in a cartoonish way, but hopefully they can still be useful. All right, so to do this work, fairly straightforward. I was comparing the disciplinary and professional origins of applied linguistics and composition. That was the mission here. And to do that, tried to approach this in a transdisciplinary way, we could say, or perhaps just interdisciplinary, drawing literature from composition, from foreign language studies, from applied linguistics, from L2 writing, from TESOL. There's tons of historical literature, but I think composition probably takes the crown for how much historical literature we have. So one thing that's interesting is sort of looking at these other disciplines and seeing how they write about their histories, that it's a bit different, naturally. But all to say that this is very much a transdisciplinary project. And what I mean by that is that thinking thinking about how these different fields of writing and language studies can interact, but sort of bringing the kinds of knowledge that they are using to make their arguments and to prove that this teaching method is better than another teaching method or whatever, bringing that to the fore and sort of working with that, which is how I understand transdisciplinarity, which is awareness of the boundaries, the epistemological boundaries of a given field. And so this is what I'm trying to make present in this work. So, all right, so I'm going to do it in 4 parts. The first part, basically, I'm just going to talk about how language sciences became tied to positivism. Second part, I'll talk about audiolingualism and drawing very heavily from the work of Paul Matsuda, talking about his histories of how audiolingualism became the kind of dominant form of language instruction. Then I'll talk about the 60s as this very formational period. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with much of this history, but I'm still going to cover it, although briefly. And then finally, I'll bring composition into the frame for that kind of comparative element. So, starting with the positivist epistemes in the early language sciences, we need to start with the invention of the modern university. Of course, very briefly, post-Civil War, we go from an antebellum curriculum to a modern research university curriculum, aka we go from liberal arts curriculum, where everyone is sort of taking the same courses along the same route, to a disciplinary curriculum where knowledge begins to be divided into different pieces and people begin to specialize. And so within that specialization, we eventually get these broad categories of humanities, social sciences, and the natural sciences, of course. But specific to the language sciences, just very briefly, that history, early 1900s, we have philology being the dominant model here, which was both a textual and grammatical study of language, but it was also contained this sort of cultural and interpretive component. When universities switched over to the disciplinary model and positivism or scientific knowledge became the predominant kind of way to produce knowledge, that the philology part of, or rather the cultural part of understanding language got pushed out. And what we were left out with over a period of 30 years essentially was the language sciences, sort of the study of language as this, we'd say, grammar, forms, things like that, that what we can observe. And so this is going to relate to positivism. We'll talk about the next slide in a second. I'll come back to what that meant for language sciences. Here's a quote. This is Leonard Bloomfield. He was one of the kind of early proto-linguists, we might call him. He writes in 1914, in accord with the true purpose of colleges and the university, the instructors there employed are not pedagogues, but people who have found their calling in the handling of culture or in scientific teaching and research. Professional language teacher who occasionally finds his way into these institutions soon learns that he can expect neither honor nor advancement for excellence in his vocation. He must exchange it for more purely cultural or scientific studies or be content with a minor position. So as it was in 1914, it is in 2023 that research is king, and these scientific positive epistemes are still very much with us today. What can you prove that is observable? So what this meant, this becoming the dominant episteme, positivism, and so now's a good time to define it. In this case, positivism refers to an understanding of the world where objective observation and measurement of worldly materials serve as the primary basis for rational argument. So in terms of language, what is language? How do we study language? That means that language has stable properties upon which generalizations can be made, that language can be counted, categorized, made sense of as a rational structure. We would observe language like a scientist looking at it underneath a microscope, probing and discovering its secrets. Even the very idea that there are discrete languages ties heavily into that there is an English, that there is a Polish, that there is a Chinese, right? They all sort of fit nicely with this idea that language is a thing in the world that we can study. So all to say, the language sciences were invented around the beginning of the 20th century, and professionalism and the ways that American universities divided into disciplines tied the academic study of language to positive epistemologies and ways of knowing. So moving on here to talk about an instance of how these positivist epistemologies and these researchers who are working on language sort of transform that into language instruction, is talking about the audiolingualism. So to do that, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but here's a general sort of timeline of key events. And again, I'm drawing from the work of Paul Matsuda, but also the foreign language scholar Bernhardt, and we'll look at a quote of hers on the next slide. But there's sort of four sort of major instances here. I'm going to brush past the Coleman report, actually not even talk about it, but start with the Good Neighbor policy, which is a policy that was, kind of the initiation of American soft power in the world, or rather the sort of conscious linking of academic institutions with that soft power. And specifically, that was a Roosevelt policy, sending folks down to South America to teach English, and then bringing ideally sort of elite folks from South America up to the United States to work in our universities and be students. So I'll come back to this idea of American soft power when we get to the 60s. But the other two important institutions here, and this is Matsuda's argument, that the ELI, the first the University of Michigan English Language Institute, was the first institute of first instance of institutionalized language teaching at the university level. And then the Army Specialist Training Program, which I'll start with there, which was a program which was developed by the Army during World War II to develop speakers of Japanese and German, Italian, and other languages that were relevant. And the ELI was, in a sense, a response to these increasing number of international students coming to the United States. But that is to say, both of these programs, which were sort of the first of their kind in a way, the faculty of those programs, the design of those programs, they were drawing from the language experts at that time. And those language experts happened to be folks who were described as structural linguists and who sort of committed to these positivist epistemes as far as what language is. So I'm going to skip ahead a bit here, but by the early 60s, elements of these two language programs came together to what, in retrospect, is called the audiolingual approach, which is and largely these programs were very, very successful. And the idea is that their success sort of spawned similar programs all over the United States. And specific to the ASTP, to this day at military institutes, they teach language using the curriculum that is very similar, of course, updated for 2023, but similar to what was being taught back then. So specifically in terms of pedagogy and curriculum, this meant that an audiolingual approach primarily involved the memorization of standard phrases, vocabulary, and grammatical structures, along with this element of practice and role play and repetition, right? And so that is, in essence, the audiolingual approach. It is used to this day all over the world. Perhaps we could say it is still the dominant way to teach language. But want to sum up here with this section, this Elizabeth Bernhardt quote, and sort of we have this timeline and a summary of what all this meant. I'm going to read the slide. The 30-year period from the Coleman report to the early 60s foreshadowed the language teaching schizophrenia with which the profession ends the 20th century. The tension between the traditional humanities-based reading-oriented study of belles lettres and views advocating functionality and oral proficiency. The paradoxical image of language as part of the humanities, but simultaneously in the service of government and the military. The social problematic of maintaining and valuing a cultural identity while encouraging people to assume another. And finally, and the economics of promising in a short term what can be delivered only in the long term. And she's talking about language mastery or writing mastery, what have you. But that second to last one, the social problematic of maintaining and valuing cultural identity while encouraging people to assume another, I think that is very much relevant and prevalent in 2023. And basically Bernhardt here is arguing that, and I agree with this, that the sort of divisions that were produced way back then are still with us today in terms of the arguments and the problems we encounter. Going to move on here. And so want to contextualize all of this. And the purpose of contextualizing all of this in the 60s is that essentially, in this paper, I argue that this is the time when disciplinary formations were hardened, and there's a reason for that. And those disciplinary formations have kind of stayed with us ever since then. But looking at the 60s, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these phenomenon, that looking at enrollment, total enrollment, that we have a fairly steady increase from 1870 to 1940. We get a little bit of an uptake, probably because the GI Bill, right in the mid 40s. But then from 1960 to 1970, we get this incredible spike in enrollment, right? And that is the 60s. To look a little bit more closely at that, this is 1900, 1930. I guess some steady increase, 48 to 59, a little bit more because of that World War II. But again, looking at those numbers from 1960 to 1970, total student population increased from 3.5 million to 8.5 million over a course of 10 years. Of course, along with that is total number of instructional staff nearly doubling over that same period, 281,000 to 551,000. So thinking about that and maybe even contrasting it with our current moment, that, what would it mean for our universities to double it in size, right? And granted, we're much bigger now, so to scale up, that would be more difficult. But just how much growth was happening during that period, how much change was happening in that period. And even thinking about faculty, how many new people were coming into the university, right? So, oopsie. Oh yeah, okay. Well, so want to talk a little bit about why was this happening? What was this growth? And I'm not going to go into detail on this stuff because I'm just going to assume that folks are fairly familiar with these events. But I'll just lump the educational exchange policy and the Fulbright Act, Hayes Act together, which was essentially federal policies that were pushing forward the recruitment of international students, as well as the development of study abroad programs, which is the Fulbright Hayes Act. Most of the study abroad programs in the United States were developed from the mid 50s to the early 60s. Well, at least the initial ones anyway. And again, connecting back to this soft power business, that the rationale for this truly was that exposure, as say the education exchange policy, the argument it makes is that exposure to international students by American students was good for the reputation of the United States because it extended communications and shared educational resources on a global scale. So I'm not saying that this is a sort of determinist framework, as in like these federal policies caused international students to rise, but they were pretty heavily involved in bringing all these international students there, therefore creating the need for these these English language teaching programs. Second, the NDEA, and the HEA, of course, were these institutes of tons of money flooding into the university. The Pell Grant in the HEA, funding for HBCUs and the HEA, of course, the National Defense Act, just a little bit before the 60s to fight the perception of Soviet threats. We have for money for science and engineering, as well as for foreign language education, again, connecting to this idea that the federal government recognized this need, that American soft power and the need for Americans to communicate with the rest of the world was essential to maintain whatever, some version of hegemony. Here's just one little fun fact that I find remarkable. It is not adjusted for inflation, so I just want you guys to see this. In 1959, federal funding for universities was around $6 billion. In 1969, federal funding was around $21 billion, right? So that's almost a fourfold increase. And again, going back to enrollment and growth of faculty, that I think it's the tremendous change that happened during that period is almost unimaginable now in 2023, as humanities, social sciences, we're doing the opposite of that, where things are shrinking. So essentially, my argument here is that while composition and language instruction were influenced by many of the same socio-historical and political pressures during the first half of the 20th century, their disciplinary formation and professionalization process resulted in instructional practices that diverged significantly. And so thinking about well, why is that? Well, the field of applied linguistics, or what came to be known as applied linguistics, was built on a pre-existing set of theories and teaching practices during its disciplinary formation during the late 50s and 60s. Composition did not begin to adopt a unified theoretical and instructional approach until the early 70s, i.e. the process approach, which I'll talk about in a second. One effect of these differing development timelines is that language instruction has retained a modern theoretical base in that it remains tied to positive assumptions about language, while composition has operated with a postmodern assumption about the socially constructed relationship between language and power. So during the 60s, talking about the institutionalization of these positive epistemes, you have the founding of TESOL, ACTFL, the Center for Applied Linguistics, all three of which are very much alive and well in the world of language teaching. You also have this, and I sort of cut this part because it was a bit long, that this idea of disinterested basic research, if people are familiar with this term, which basically means research for research's sake. So Geiger argues in this one article that all the funding coming into universities during the 60s sort of untethered research from outside stakeholders, which was generally how it worked before the 60s. And so with all this new faculty, all this new money, you had this shift from folks who's deciding what research is important, shifting from outside stakeholders to the disciplines themselves. And I would say that the disciplines themselves to this day, as we know, really have the most say about what is important, what gets published, et cetera, right? But that, even though we like to think of, say, something like academic freedom as something that was always been there, Geiger is arguing that actually this was something that was more or less sort of came about because of the circumstances of the 60s. And I would say that we're still very much in those disciplinary structures, in those university structures that developed at that time. And thus the sort of fossilization of disciplinary boundaries that sort of we'll come back to in a moment. So all that said, gonna bring in composition into the picture. Actually, let me do a little prologue here. So actually, no, I'm going to move forward. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about what is the process approach, because I think we're all pretty well versed in that one. But what I do want to do, however, is talk about the process approach. So largely drawing this is David Fleming's argument that this is why process approach sort of came into being and came to be adopted by what we now know as composition and rhetoric. But to focus that on this first point, crowded and more diverse classrooms, that, you know, I like to think of things kind of in this kind of macro structural sociological way. And I find this point to be very persuasive here, that, you know, what happened in the 60s, these classrooms expanding greatly, classroom diversity expanding greatly, that the process approach was sure, it was like, yes, this is a good idea, but it was also an approach that allowed folks to deal with bigger classrooms and more diverse classrooms, because it took the onus off of the instructors in terms of correcting and grading, as one would do in the current traditional, but in, you know, peer review and workshops and things like that, drafts, right? So the process approach, actually, to think of it, yes, as a way to liberate, but also as a way to deal with this sort of these changing institutions and the fact that everyone just has more and more students, to think of it as the sort of efficient way to deal with things. But tying this to epistemology, that the constructivism is usually associated with the process approach, and my understanding of constructivism is this. Instead of knowledge being something we discover in the positivist approach, where we're looking at objects in the world, that knowledge is constructed, co-constructed, negotiated, right? So the teacher in the classroom is learning from the students is learning from the teacher, the student is also learning from their own experiences. And knowledge is a thing that is sort of unique and idiosyncratic almost, right? And that is one of the characteristics of what the process approach is doing in a classroom. Sharon Crowley, who I really love her histories of composition, talks about the process approach of also being attached to these ideologies of liberal individualism, the idea of expressivism, and the sort of representing, being able to use your voice in these democratic American settings. That was very much what was happening in the 60s and early 70s. So, all to say, this is sort of what I come up with the answer to this question. What is the difference? And I'll just kind of stop there with the history because we need to move forward. But what is the difference between teaching English writing as a process and teaching English writing as an extension of language learning? And so I made this grid. I made it like yesterday because I needed like, well, how do I show my main points? But so there's nothing revolutionary here on this grid that we have teaching writing as language as positivist, teaching writing as a process constructivist. And I sort of want to point out that I'm not talking about reality. I'm talking about the sort of epistemological mainstream of each one of these disciplines, right? And just going through here, writing as language, positivist, knowledge is observable, language consists of external forms, research is centered in the social sciences, and teaching is focused on standard forms, memorization, and performance, versus teaching writing as a process, constructivist, knowledge is negotiated, language consists of power relationships, research is centered in the humanities, teaching is focused on individual improvement, process, and argument. So my primary argument here is that those professional pressures of professionalizations push these respective fields into their mainstream or institutionalized paradigms that I would say were developed in the 60s. And so when we have resources drying up, when we have departments shrinking, that it makes that researchers are sort of forced to go into these centers. And so, you know, disciplines like or subdisciplines like WAC or CLA are sort of, they're always, in my opinion, sort of arguing anyway, destined in a way to be at the edges because these are the institutionalized cores of these respective fields. So what does this mean? So what I have outlined here, tried to, is that socio-historical factors have had a significant impact on professionalization in these respective fields, which has driven both research and teaching. And further, that the epistemological assumptions of both process writing and language instruction have been, to a degree, fossilized via disciplinary divisions. So to be clear, I'm not arguing that there are necessary essential differences between teaching writing as a process or teaching writing as a language, or that either mode of writing instruction has some kind of material, epistemologically pure incarnation. And very importantly, I'm also not arguing that one is better than the other. And I really want to make that clear. I think language standards get a lot of flack these days, this idea of language standards, and deservedly so. At the same time, they are still an incredibly effective way to teach language, and I would say is the dominant mode of teaching language throughout the world, bar none. So just want to point that out. This is not sort of a fight. This is sort of, can we appreciate both of these for what they do and what they afford us in the classroom? So that is to say, I am arguing that demarcating these two epistemologies can lend insight into the teaching practices and arguments that scholar teachers use to promote a given approach to writing. Sorry, I lost my place. Further, given the wide range of approaches to writing instruction that have been developed over the last 50-some years, recognizing these constructivist and positive epistemes in our everyday teaching practices can inform decisions about the appropriateness of a pedagogy or curriculum for students, program, or institution. So let me give you an example of that. This is, okay. So for example, a process approach, in addition to being well suited for a diversity of student backgrounds and relatively large classrooms, is also teaching, according to Crowley, what could be described as American style liberalism, a mode of instruction that is compatible with contemporary liberal arts curriculum that actively helps students to develop constructivist critical frames. And by that same token, teaching versions of standard English norms reinforces positivist forms of knowledge that are likely to be compatible with contemporary practices in the sciences and some social sciences. If writing professionals are working with chemistry teachers via a WAC or WIT approach, the presence of an individual voice, I would argue, is not as conducive to the kinds of knowledge that chemistry is attempting to discover. Another example, if writing professionals are working with L2 writers at the level of first-year composition, and these writers don't have full command of grammar, vocabulary, whatever full command means, a translingual approach may confuse and complicate the learning goals of students. Then again, if instructors are teaching L2 writing as part of a broader liberal arts curriculum, a translingual approach is well suited to the task. So that's not to say that each of these approaches do not have a place with the university, but that the usefulness of each of these approaches should be evaluated not on the level of ideology or how it aligns with disciplinary trends, but by the particular institutional context one is working in. And I just can't but assume that WAC people are on board, certainly with that last statement. And finally, kind of on the last note, and connecting this back to Ola's presentation, that Ola showed us that kind of chart of second language writing and its relationship to rhetoric and composition, and sort of how second language writing has been using less and less research from rhetoric and composition. That one thing that my argument suggests, and there's more in here I'm not talking about, but is that second language writing is actually going to move towards applied linguistics forevermore, just because the disciplinary pressures of how one gets promoted are going to force people in that direction. So long as universities continue to shrink and contract in the United States when it comes to humanities and some social sciences. So I think I had one more WAC specific slide, but I think we'll skip that, references, and we'll just move on to questions. So thank you all for listening. I know that was a bit long, but history, gosh, is hard to talk about in a PPT. All right, so we have about 15 minutes for questions.
And I will also be looking if somebody has a question from the online audience. I have the chat open from the FOVA app, so I'll be looking there too. But maybe Tyler, first I'll ask you a question. What do you think about this communicative approach to language teaching? Like, how does that feature in this positivist look at language studies? Because
Right.
you know, the audiolingual method, it was very much pushed out by this nebulous approach to language teaching called communicative approach to language teaching. So,
Right.
so how does
Right.
that work in there?
Right. Well, great question, Ola. I'm so glad you asked that. So my understanding is that communicative language approaching teaches didn't happen to the 70s and 80s, right? And that's when it sort of started to become more of a thing. And so my argument is sort of saying not that there aren't sort of alternative ways, but that the root of those alternative ways is rooted in institutions that are still subscribing to a particular episteme when it comes to what is language. And so these communicative approaches do add to the sort of communicative and ability for language learners or language teachers to teach negotiation, but I would still say that they're still rooted in this particular positivist, whatever that word is, paradigm. Does that answer your question, sort of?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. See,
we have a question in the audience. And I don't think we have any audio.
I have a microphone.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. That was, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Terry Zwocki. Hi, Tyler.
Hi, Terry. Hi.
I'm trying to think of how to formulate this question because your two presentations went together so well. I was almost wishing that Tyler had gone first and then you, because of the way they spoke to each other. So
Terry, that was our original plan. We changed it at the last minute, but whatever.
So I'm thinking that from when I've been looking at the Journal of the Second Language Writing, it seems like there's and I'm not done this scientifically, so pardon me for not drawing on any kind of comparative data, but it seems like there's still a lot of composition coming into that, maybe because many of the people, I'm thinking of someone like Chris Tardy, for example, who I think comes out of Purdue, where they've been trained in Ret Comp and they have these L2 certifications. So it feels like there's a lot still of that cross field work being done. So I was kind of surprised to see what you were saying with your findings. I don't know if there's a question in there, other than if you could just speak to that a little bit more about second language journal, second language writing.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I agree that there is still a lot of, like, actually just like, people who came from, like 20 years ago, where composition and rhetoric and second language writing really were so much tied together, and that has had an impact on second language writing journal. But the other thing that happened to second language writing journal, it's really became a journal that has a wide global readership, and also very wide global authorship. And so over time, we see that people who publish in Journal of Second Language Writing, even though there's still, like, authorship skewed towards United States, there's so much more diversity. So you will still see traces. You'll still see how composition and rhetoric has been, comes back, and there's, like, for example, with Chris Tardy, and like genre approaches to writing still kind of is very prominent. But with that, what is also prominent, for example, with genre, is how Swales and, like, more applied linguistics approach to studying writing is kind of grew over time too. So so even though we see that, maybe, like, we see that influence, like, just the data shows clearly, much more clearly, in that just chart, that the movement has been more towards applied linguistics, which still, like, retains some, such as, like, genre studies. It's such a big part of applied linguistics itself, but it does not come from that rhetorical, from the Miller perspective, right? It doesn't come from the rhetoric and composition perspective. It comes from the Swales perspective. So I don't know really if that answers your question, but
yes, thank you. Yeah.
Right. But can I also just say one thing about Terry, about the Purdue connection here, which is that, yeah, you're right. Chris Tardy comes there, Paul Matsuda comes from there, I come from there, Ola comes from there. So there's this thing that happens at Purdue for whatever reason, where we get hung up on these particular boundaries. So just wanted to add that into the conversation.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Maureen Matheson, and as both of you are talking, it's very interesting to me, because I think one of the things, Tyler, that you mentioned is this idea of interdisciplinarity, and then looking at, Ola, the analysis of research publications. People in institutions do not get rewarded for doing interdisciplinary research. It is, according to the interdisciplinary research, one of the probably worst ways to get tenure, right? And so you are actually advised against it many times, because who will your reviewers be? Who is your audience? You're kind of in this liminal space where, in many ways, you're actually breaking boundaries, which is a good thing, right? You're creating new knowledge, but at the same time, you're not legible to many people, because you don't speak their language, right? Which is disciplinary specific.
Right.
So I think you also see this notion of what I consider is disciplines act as their own cultures, and they create these boundaries. And if you step outside those boundaries, you are not going to be rewarded.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. 100. That research goes unseen. I mean, that's kind of the point, that with that we have to move, as resources shrink up, that we have to move more towards the center in order to get published. Yeah, absolutely. There was something else I was going to say, but Ola, were you going to say anything in response to that?
Well, and I think what I can add, this is an IWAC conference, the International Writing Across Curriculum. So as a person who works in a published university, which is here in the background, I feel like it is less so in other places. And I think what features in my research is looking at Scopus or Web of Science, these kind of two big indexes that really, for oftentimes for the early promotion, really, what it doesn't really matter if you're publishing in your discipline, but what matters if you publish in those top journals. So these tenure and promotion rewards, I think in some ways are contextualized in terms of where we geographically located. What is the structure of rewards? But I know very much so in the United States, it's, your committee will be looking at journals that maybe would not be even in any way rewarded in Poland. So if I actually decided to publish with WAC Clearinghouse or Journal of Writing Analytics that I publish, my university doesn't really care, doesn't recognize that as a valuable place, even though I disciplinarily value it so much and I know it's really good work. But these how different contexts and cultures and academic cultures shape our activities is really, I feel, sometimes very kind of limiting, and doesn't reward what we're interested in and what we find valuable as individuals.
Sure, right. And to sort of add to that, that there's for the last 20 years, like I've seen so many of these papers where there's sort of like, we need more language in writing, we need more rhetoric and humanities and language studies. And like they're always good-natured calls, but and maybe this is just a deep cynicism on my part, but I just feel like those calls are just they're meaningless, because what is determining these disciplinary boundaries are these sort of bigger macro structures that we're not really thinking about, because we've been trained as researchers and we're not sort of trained to think about those things, and it drives so much of what we research and how we research, and yeah, so I'm saying that.
So my question sort of builds on that. It's mostly for Tyler, since you gave us the more process presentation and all this was more of a genre presentation, but not that there's anything wrong with that. But where do you see these pressures that you so fascinatingly describe, and they sort of left us with this bifurcation? I am not a researcher, I'm an instructor. But what, where do these pressures, shrinking resources, et cetera, where do you both see them as pushing language instruction and or research going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is thinking about and maybe these things are not being debated anymore, but the translingual debates from about 5 years ago, the infamous, at least to me, it's sort of letter, the Atkinson et al. Letter, sort of saying that this translingual movement in composition is going to take jobs away from second language writing scholars. So I mean, just that in itself, I think, is an example of that tension. That's one thing I can think of. Yeah, does that speak to that?
I think in teaching, and in teaching, I think, as I listen to you, Tyler, and we always talk about this, is how do we teach writing? And if, for example, as a second language writing instructor, as someone who learned English as a second language writing, I have spent, when I was learning, I spent a ton of time learning standard English, and I found that useful and find that something that helped me actually to be here and talk to you today, right? But thinking about language as grammar and teaching and grammar as a word, and thinking about how we can use kind of linguistic knowledge and implement it in teaching writing, and what is its function in either a disciplinary course, in the first year writing course. I feel like for a very long time it was something that was negatively perceived and something that was unwelcome in composition practice, to talk about like what, sentence structure or anything that is like kind of related with language. And I feel like that came out of this disciplinary positivist versus a constructivist a kind of division. What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, right. I mean, there's just like, I mean, and connecting that and the translingual thing, this like very much at the present, this like standard language forms, we need to get away from that and move into this other thing. And it's like, I just don't, I think both are really valuable, and I think both have a function, right? So yeah, that's what I will add.
Yeah, but always asking for what purpose, for what audience, like why are we
Right.
teaching the things we're teaching? Not that these things are forbidden and these things are
Right,
allowed, but like,
right. And
what do we
this
need
kind
to
of,
teach? Yeah.
right, why do we need to cancel out other forms of teaching in order to put ours forward? And I think that is like, that's a function of the academy and what we need to do as researchers. And I think that's probably, instead of doing that, saying, okay, here's one way to teach it, here's one way to teach it, here's one way to teach it, here's one way to teach it. Let's think about what each one of these affords and make it all available, rather than saying, this is the way you teach, and then 10 years later saying, no, this is the way you teach, right?
We're in a post method work. Isn't that the point of being in a post method teaching? I mean, that's sort of
Sure.
where we arrived at, right? There
Right.
are these, you fashion your own amalgam of teaching methods and call it, put your name after it with ism,
Right.
and
Right, sure, right. But then we have this like mess of like everything, what is that movie? Everywhere, Everything, All at Once. Right. And it's like, how do we put all that together? Because we know so much, we've done so much work over the last 50 years, but everything is just so absolutely fragmented, at least from my perspective, that it's just so hard to find a book and be like, okay, here's 12 ways you can teach writing. I know that exists, but it's just like, maybe there's like 12 different books that say that. So, and in a sense that the paper pushes more towards this sort of like finding these ways, transdisciplinary ways to sort of merge our knowledge bases, I think, and even the effort, maybe not the specific recommendations I make, but just the very effort, I think we really have to be involved in that all the time, even though our professional incentives are telling us not to. Yeah.
I have a question, because this has always been, I think you brought up a very good thing, is that we're beyond methodologies, right? At some point. And in terms of pedagogy, I teach primarily in STEM and do research in science. And it's very interesting to me because the language, right? That's a whole different discourse. And so it always gets muddy when we talk about language. And I wonder what you think about, because we're not only teaching students to communicate either in their first or second or possibly third language, we're actually adding what I would consider another language, which is the language of their discipline. And so for me, one of the things I always think about, what drives my own teaching when I'm teaching, for example, science writing, is what responsibility do I have to acknowledge language difference across all the languages and the cultures that we're engaging with, right? So what are your thoughts in terms of the presentations that you just gave?
Yeah. Well, my initial thought, maybe you can say something here, is that tension has always been there. And I would say that tension is a product of the academy itself and the sort of dominance of one particular model of what language is. But yeah, the tension between, say, assimilation versus negotiation. And I would say, like, it's always going to be there. There's no way to solve for that. There's no pedagogy, no curriculum that is somehow going to get rid of that problem, because that problem is built into the pillars of what is research in our academic institutions, is what I would say. That's probably not a very satisfying answer. But thinking historically about it, that's where I'm coming from. I don't know. Ola, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think it's always, because with this question of assimilation, or pointing out that students are bringing various resources even to like the scientific writing course, I think it's also important to ask them what they want. And I think oftentimes people will like assume they want this, so they want that, or we impose a pedagogy on them without maybe asking what their goals are. But I'm not assuming that the person who asked this question, I don't think I see you, but I don't think this is what happens in the class. But I think that's another important factor that maybe doesn't get enough like representation or research, and that comes back to this question of you know, trying to teach students to negotiate disciplinary discourse, but also maybe asking them what they want to take out of the class and what they want to learn, what kind of language they want to get, even if they are bringing these different resources to classroom. But I think, you know, but I think in, for example, in scientific writing and I thinking from more applied linguistics perspective, I think this positivist view kind of also comes into place because there's so much research and scientific discourse in applied linguistics, but it will always come down to like, what are some common phrases that are used, what kind of verbs are being used, so that there's this way of like measure and kind of describe that language and then teach that language quite nicely. And it doesn't really ask maybe as much question of like who the writers are, what kind of cultural backgrounds they bring. But it is an easier tool, like quite nice pedagogical tool to have to kind of look at that scientific language through this, as Tyler was talking through this microscope, kind of pull it apart and analyze it and see what comes out of that.
I want to add one thing to what Ola just said about what do students want, and and also talking about tension points. And this is like in the classroom where I have, say, if I'm in the United States, having international students coming over, that they tell me that they want to learn the conventions of things, right? But then there's also through curriculum, through process approach, maybe it's indirect, but it is these sort of ideologies of expressivism that sometimes I'm just not sure, does that really fit? Am I putting upon them this particular American hegemonic view of how the world should work when I'm teaching, say, something that is deeply a process approach, or say, you know, but yeah, that tension, I don't have answers to how to solve that tension, but certainly I feel like it comes up a lot. And as I've been sort of working in China, this question of, am I bringing with me these ideologies, this sort of not post-colonial, but literally colonial sort of position on what is right and what is true in that writing classroom for them. So yeah, no answers, but we should, does that sort of speak to your question? Yeah.
She said yes. I'm sorry to cut everybody off. We have
To
close
stop.
the session now.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate the audience.
Yes, thank you for
we
coming.
Wish we were there in person, really, but I can't
Yes.
even leave my house, so
Yeah.
I couldn't go over there.
Right.
I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you guys so much.
Bye.